The greatest tragedy of modern life isn't poverty. It isn't war. It isn't even death. The greatest tragedy is that most people will live their entire lives without ever truly understanding how life works. They'll make the same mistakes over and over again. They'll suffer through predictable pain that could have been avoided. They'll chase goals that won't make them happy. And they'll die never knowing that there was a better way. I'm Ray Dalio, and over the past 50 years, I've made every mistake you can imagine. I've been broke, I've been arrogant, I've lost everything, and had to start over. But through all of that pain, I discovered something remarkable. Life operates according to principles, and if you understand these principles, you can navigate reality far more effectively than 99% of people ever will. Today, I want to share with you the most important lessons I've learned about life, success, failure, and what actually matters. This isn't theory. This is what actually works. Let me start by telling you about the worst moment of my life, because it taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned. It was 1982, and I had just made the biggest professional mistake of my career. I had built Bridgewater Associates from nothing into a successful investment firm. We were managing money for major institutions. I was appearing on Wall Street Week and testifying before Congress. I felt like I had it all figured out. And that's exactly when reality hit me in the face. I had become convinced that we were heading into a major economic depression. I analyzed the data. I studied the patterns. I was absolutely certain that the economy was about to collapse and the stock market would crash. I told anyone who would listen. I went on television and predicted doom. I positioned our portfolios for the apocalypse. And I was completely, spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. The economy didn't collapse. Instead, it began one of the greatest bull markets in history. I lost money for my clients. I had to let go of all of my employees except for one. I was so broke that I had to borrow $4,000 from my father to help pay my family's bills. At age 33, after working for over a decade to build my company, I was essentially starting over from zero. That experience was incredibly painful. It was humbling in a way that nothing else in my life had been, but it was also the best thing that ever happened to me. Why? Because it forced me to confront a fundamental truth about reality. I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. My confidence had exceeded my competence. And if I was going to succeed going forward, I needed to completely change how I approached decision-making. That failure transformed me from someone who thought he had the answers into someone who was genuinely curious about discovering what was true. It transformed me from being arrogant into being radically open-minded. And that transformation is what ultimately allowed Bridgewater to become the most successful hedge fund in the world. Here's the first principle I learned from that experience. Pain plus reflection equals progress. Most people experience pain and try to avoid it as quickly as possible. They distract themselves, they blame others, they make excuses, they do anything except sit with the pain and ask themselves what it's trying to teach them. But pain is actually one of life's most important teachers. Every time you experience pain, whether it's physical, emotional, financial, or professional, that pain is telling you something important about reality. It's showing you where your understanding of how things work is incomplete or incorrect. Think about it. If you touch a hot stove and get burned, the pain teaches you not to touch hot stoves. That's obvious, but the same principle applies to every other type of pain. If you lose money on an investment, the pain should teach you something about your investment process. If a relationship fails, the pain should teach you something about how you choose partners or how you behave in relationships. If you get fired from a job, the pain should teach you something about your skills or your attitude or your alignment with that particular role. The pain itself is not the problem. The problem is experiencing pain and learning nothing from it, which means you're doomed to experience that same pain again. After my devastating failure in 1982, I made a conscious decision to treat every mistake and every painful experience as an opportunity to learn. I started writing down my principles, the decision-making rules that I would follow to avoid making the same mistakes twice. Over the decades, this grew into a comprehensive collection of hundreds of principles, covering everything from how to make better decisions to how to build better organizations to how to live a better life. These principles became the foundation for everything I did at Bridgewater. We built them into our culture. We used them to make decisions. We shared them openly with everyone in the organization, and they worked far better than I ever could have imagined. Let me share with you the second critical principle that transformed my life. Radical truth and radical transparency are the keys to meaningful relationships and effective organizations. Most people operate with a huge gap between what they actually think and what they're willing to say. They hide their real opinions. They avoid difficult conversations. They let problems fester rather than addressing them directly. Why? Because confronting truth is uncomfortable, it creates conflict, it risks damaging relationships. So people choose comfort over truth, and they pay a massive price for that choice. At Bridgewater, we built our entire culture around the opposite approach. We made it not just acceptable, but expected that people would say exactly what they think. If you disagree with someone, even if that person is me or another senior leader, you're obligated to speak up. If you see a problem, you're obligated to surface it. If someone is underperforming, we talk about it openly rather than gossiping behind their backs. This was extremely uncomfortable at first, especially for new employees coming from traditional corporate environments where political game playing is the norm. But over time, people realized that radical transparency creates an environment where problems get solved faster, where the best ideas win, regardless of who suggests them, and where you can actually trust what people tell you. Here's why this matters so much. In most organizations and in most relationships, people waste enormous amounts of energy on politics and positioning. They're not focused on discovering truth and solving problems. They're focused on protecting their ego and advancing their interests. This creates enormous inefficiency. Good ideas get ignored because they came from the wrong person. Bad ideas get implemented because they came from the right person. Problems don't get addressed until they become crises. And everyone is operating with incomplete or incorrect information because people aren't sharing what they really think. Radical transparency eliminates all of that waste. When everyone is committed to truth above all else, when egos are subordinated to the mission of discovering what's actually true, you create an environment where you can solve problems at a vastly higher level. You get the benefit of multiple perspectives. You pressure test ideas rigorously. You identify mistakes quickly before they compound. And you build genuine trust because people know you're going to tell them the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Now, let me be clear. Radical transparency doesn't mean being brutally honest in a cruel or insensitive way. It doesn't mean you should say every thought that pops into your head. There's a right way and a wrong way to deliver difficult feedback. The goal is not to hurt people's feelings. The goal is to help people understand reality so they can improve. But within those boundaries, the commitment has to be to truth first, comfort second. Most people have it backwards. They prioritize comfort and pay the price in terms of living in delusion and making worse decisions. The third principle I want to share is about how to think about goals and success. Most people approach life with completely backwards thinking about what will make them happy. They believe that achieving certain goals, whether it's making a certain amount of money or reaching a certain position or acquiring certain possessions will make them happy. So they work incredibly hard to achieve those goals. And here's what happens. They achieve the goal, they feel happy for a brief moment, and then they adapt to their new reality, and they're right back where they started in terms of their baseline level of happiness. Then they set a new goal, thinking that this time it will be different, and the cycle repeats. I've experienced this pattern many times in my own life. When I was starting out, I thought that if I could just make enough money to be financially comfortable, I would be happy. Then I achieved that, and it wasn't enough. I thought if I could build a successful company, I would be happy. I achieved that, and it still wasn't enough. I thought if I could be recognized as one of the best investors in the world, I would be happy. I achieved that, and while it was satisfying, it didn't fundamentally change my level of contentment. The mistake I was making, and the mistake that most people make, is thinking that happiness comes from achieving outcomes. It doesn't. Happiness comes from the process of pursuing meaningful goals and evolving toward becoming a better version of yourself. Here's what I've learned. The pleasure you get from achieving a goal is temporary. It fades quickly. But the satisfaction you get from the struggle, from overcoming challenges, from learning and growing and becoming more capable, that's sustainable. That's what actually makes life meaningful. So the secret isn't to achieve your goals and then be happy. The secret is to fall in love with the process of pursuing goals that matter to you. Fall in love with the struggle. Fall in love with the learning. Fall in love with the evolution. When you do that, you can be happy even when you're facing setbacks, because you know that the struggle itself is what makes life rich and meaningful. This is why I've always been suspicious of people who say their goal is to retire and relax on a beach. If you've spent your whole life working toward the goal of not having to work anymore, you've missed the point entirely. The goal isn't to escape work. The goal is to find work that's so meaningful and engaging that you would do it even if you didn't need the money. When you find that, when your work is aligned with your deeper purpose, then the question of work versus leisure becomes irrelevant. You're doing what you're meant to do, and that itself is the reward. Let me tell you about the fourth principle, which is about how to make better decisions. Most people make decisions based on what they want to be true rather than what is actually true. They let their ego, their biases, their emotions, and their blind spots distort their perception of reality. And then they're surprised when their decisions don't produce the outcomes they wanted. If you want to make consistently good decisions, you need to develop the ability to see reality accurately, even when that reality is uncomfortable or contradicts what you want to believe. The best way I've found to do this is through something I call believability-weighted decision-making. Here's how it works. When you're trying to make a decision, you want to gather input from multiple people with different perspectives, but not all perspectives are equally valuable. Someone who has spent 20 years successfully navigating the type of situation you're facing has a more believable perspective than someone who has never dealt with that situation before. Someone who has a track record of being right about similar decisions has a more believable perspective than someone who has a track record of being wrong. So instead of treating all opinions equally, which is what most democratic decision-making does, you weight people's input based on their believability on that particular topic. You still want to hear from everyone, because sometimes the least experienced person will see something that everyone else missed. But when you're synthesizing all of that input into a decision, you give more weight to the people who have demonstrated through their track record that they understand how that particular type of situation works. This sounds simple, but it's actually quite difficult to implement, especially in your own head. Your ego doesn't want to admit that someone else might understand something better than you do. Your biases want to give more weight to opinions that confirm what you already believe. Your emotions want to avoid uncomfortable truths. So developing the ability to accurately assess believability, including having the humility to recognize when your own believability on a topic is low, that's one of the most valuable skills you can develop. I've spent decades trying to get better at this, and I've built systems and tools to help. At Bridgewater, we literally created software that tracks people's believability on different topics based on their track record, and we use that to weight people's input in our decision-making processes. We also use tools that help us identify our blind spots and biases, but the technology is secondary. The real key is developing genuine humility and genuine curiosity about discovering truth rather than being right. The fifth principle is about dealing with reality as it is, not as you wish it were. I've observed that most people spend enormous amounts of energy fighting against reality. They complain about how things should be different. They get angry that the world doesn't work the way they think it should work. They waste time and energy wishing things were different rather than accepting reality and figuring out how to navigate it effectively. This is completely backwards and incredibly costly. Reality is what it is. You can choose to accept it and work with it, or you can choose to fight against it and be miserable. But you cannot change fundamental realities through wishful thinking or complaint. Gravity exists whether you like it or not. Human nature is what it is, whether you like it or not. Economic principles work the way they work, whether you like it or not. The sooner you accept these realities and stop fighting against them, the sooner you can focus your energy on the only thing that actually matters, which is figuring out how to get what you want given the reality you're operating in. Let me give you a concrete example. Many people get angry about economic inequality. They think it's unfair that some people have so much more wealth than others. They think the system should be different, and they spend enormous amounts of energy complaining about this reality. Now, you can certainly work to change systems and policies if you want to. That's a valid choice. But what most people don't do is accept the reality that significant economic inequality exists in our current system and then figure out how to navigate that reality to achieve their own goals. They let their anger about how things should be different prevent them from taking effective action given how things actually are. The same principle applies to everything. Maybe you wish your boss was different, or your spouse was different, or your children were different, or your own capabilities were different. But wishing doesn't change reality. Accepting reality and then figuring out how to work with it, that's what changes your outcomes. This doesn't mean you should be passive or accept injustice. It means you should be clear-eyed about what is actually true so you can make effective decisions about what to do. The sixth principle is about evolution and adaptation. One of the most important insights I've had is that life is essentially a series of adaptations to changing circumstances. The environment changes, and organisms either adapt or they die. This is true in nature, and it's equally true in business, in careers, in relationships, and in personal development. The individuals and organizations that survive and thrive over long periods are the ones that are constantly learning, evolving, and adapting to new realities. This means you should never think you've figured it all out. You should never think you've reached the point where you can stop learning and growing. The moment you become convinced that you know how things work and you stop being curious and open-minded, that's the moment you start dying, because the world keeps changing, and if you're not changing with it, you're falling behind. This is why I've always tried to surround myself with people who will challenge my thinking. This is why I've built systems at Bridgewater to capture and learn from our mistakes. This is why, even at 75 years old, I'm still trying to learn and improve every single day. Evolution requires failure. You cannot evolve without making mistakes and learning from them. So instead of trying to avoid failure, which is impossible, you should be trying to fail well. Fail fast so you can learn quickly. Fail in ways that give you useful information Fail at things where the downside is limited so the failure doesn't destroy you. But don't avoid failure entirely, because that means you're not pushing yourself hard enough. The people and organizations that succeed the most over long periods are not the ones that fail the least. They're the ones that learn the most from their failures and evolve the fastest. Let me tell you about the seventh principle, which is about understanding systems and cause and effect relationships. Most people have a very superficial understanding of how things work. They see events happening, but they don't understand the underlying cause and effect relationships that produce those events. This means they can't predict what will happen next, and they can't effectively intervene to change outcomes. If you want to be effective at anything, you need to understand the machine that's producing the outcomes you're observing. Let me give you an example from economics. Most people see inflation rising and they think it's caused by greedy corporations raising prices. That's the superficial first-order explanation. But if you actually understand how the economic machine works, you know that inflation is primarily caused by the relationship between the supply and demand for money and credit. When central banks create more money than there are goods and services to buy, prices rise. That's a second-order cause. And that money creation is often driven by political pressures to fund government spending without raising taxes, which is a third-order cause. And those political pressures are driven by societal conflicts over how resources should be distributed, which is a fourth-order cause. When you understand all of these layers of causation, you can make much better predictions about what will happen next. You can see that inflation is not just a random event or the result of corporate greed. It's the predictable outcome of specific policy choices interacting with fundamental economic principles. And once you see that, you can position yourself accordingly. This type of systems thinking, this ability to see through the surface of events to the underlying cause and effect relationships, this is one of the most valuable cognitive skills you can develop. I've spent my entire career trying to understand the economic and market machines at this deep level. I've studied hundreds of historical cases. I've built detailed models of how different parts of the system interact. I've looked for patterns that repeat across time and geography. And all of that work has given me the ability to see things that most people miss. Not because I'm smarter, but because I've invested the time to understand how the machine works at a fundamental level. The eighth principle is about the importance of meaningful work and meaningful relationships. At the end of the day, those are the only two things that really matter. Not money, not status, not possessions, meaningful work and meaningful relationships. Everything else is secondary. I've known many wealthy people who were miserable because they didn't have work they found meaningful or relationships they found fulfilling. And I've known people with modest means who were deeply content because they had both of those things. Meaningful work is work that you care about, that uses your unique abilities, that contributes something valuable to the world, and that allows you to grow and evolve. It doesn't have to be prestigious. It doesn't have to make you rich. It just has to be something that matters to you and that you can pursue with full engagement. When you have that, when you wake up in the morning excited about what you're going to work on, when you go to bed at night feeling like you contributed something valuable, that's when work becomes a source of deep satisfaction rather than just a means to an end. Meaningful relationships are relationships where you can be fully authentic, where there's genuine care and respect, where you help each other grow and evolve, and where you can work through conflicts in healthy ways. These relationships, whether they're with a spouse, family members, close friends, or colleagues, these are what make life rich. Humans are social creatures. We're wired to need deep connection with other humans. When we don't have that, when our relationships are superficial or transactional, we suffer. No amount of money or achievement can compensate for a lack of meaningful relationships. What I've learned over the decades is that meaningful work and meaningful relationships reinforce each other. When you're doing work that matters to you, you attract people who care about similar things and you form deeper connections. When you have strong relationships, they support you in pursuing meaningful work. And both of these things together create a life that feels purposeful and satisfying at a deep level. This is what I've tried to build at Bridgewater, not just a successful business, but a community of people doing meaningful work together and forming meaningful relationships in the process. The ninth principle is about understanding different perspectives and getting above your own circumstances to see the bigger picture. One of the most liberating realizations I've ever had is that my perspective is just one perspective among billions. The way I see the world is shaped by my particular experiences, my culture, my generation, my personality, and countless other factors. Someone with different experiences will see the same reality completely differently. And neither of us is necessarily right or wrong. We're just seeing different aspects of a complex reality. Once you truly internalize this, it changes everything about how you interact with people who disagree with you. Instead of seeing disagreement as a threat or as evidence that the other person is stupid or wrong, you can see it as an opportunity to learn something. They're seeing something you're not seeing. If you can understand their perspective, you'll have a more complete picture of reality. This doesn't mean all perspectives are equally valid or that there's no such thing as truth. It means that truth is often more complex than any single perspective can capture, and synthesizing multiple perspectives gets you closer to truth than clinging rigidly to your own perspective. This is why I've always sought out people who see the world differently than I do. I want people who will disagree with me and challenge my thinking, not people who will just tell me I'm right, because the former helps me see my blind spots and evolve my thinking, while the latter just reinforces whatever biases I already have. This is also why I've studied history extensively and looked at how different societies at different times approach similar problems. Every culture and every era has something to teach us if we're willing to learn from their perspective. Let me tell you about the 10th principle, which is probably the most controversial thing I'll say. You need to embrace your struggles and challenges rather than trying to avoid them. Our culture teaches us that the good life is a comfortable life, free from stress and difficulty. This is completely backwards. The good life is a challenging life where you're constantly pushing yourself to grow and evolve. Comfort is not the goal. Growth is the goal. And growth requires struggle. Think about how you actually develop any capability. You stress the system beyond its current capacity. That stress is uncomfortable. Your muscles hurt. Your brain hurts. You feel frustrated and inadequate. But that stress is what triggers adaptation. Your body or your mind responds to the stress by building greater capacity. And then you can handle things that were previously beyond your ability. Every single capability you have, from your physical strength to your intellectual abilities to your emotional resilience, was built through this process of stress, discomfort, adaptation, and growth. So when you encounter a difficult challenge, your first instinct might be to avoid it or to wish it wasn't happening. But if you can shift your mindset, you can see that challenge as exactly what you need to evolve to the next level. The universe is handing you opportunity to grow. The question is whether you'll embrace that opportunity or run from it. The people who achieve extraordinary things are not people who avoided difficulty. They're people who ran toward difficulty, who actively sought out challenges that would force them to grow, who understood that the struggle itself is what makes life meaningful. This is very different from seeking out suffering for its own sake. I'm not saying you should make your life unnecessarily difficult. I'm saying that when difficulty appears, which it inevitably will, you should embrace it as an opportunity rather than seeing it as an obstacle. You should ask yourself what this challenge is trying to teach you, how you can use it to become better, and what principles you can extract from navigating it successfully that will help you handle future challenges. Now, let me share the 11th principle, which is about thinking in probabilities rather than certainties. Most people want certainty. They want to know exactly what's going to happen so they can plan accordingly. But the reality is that the future is fundamentally uncertain. We can't know what's going to happen. We can only assess probabilities. And people who insist on certainty before acting end up paralyzed, unable to make decisions because they can never gather enough information to be completely certain. The better approach is to think probabilistically. For any given decision, there are multiple possible outcomes, each with some probability of occurring. Your job is not to predict exactly what will happen. Your job is to assess those probabilities as accurately as you can, and then make the decision that has the best expected value, considering both the probabilities and the magnitudes of different outcomes. This might sound abstract, so let me give you a concrete example. Let's say you're considering whether to start a new business. You can't know for certain whether it will succeed or fail, but you can assess, based on your research and experience, that it has maybe a 30% chance of being very successful, a 40% chance of moderate success, and a 30% chance of failure. You can also assess the magnitude of outcomes. Very successful might mean making $10 million. Moderate success might mean making $1 million. Failure might mean losing $100,000. When you multiply the probabilities times the magnitudes, you get the expected value. In this case, it's about $3.7 million in expected value, which suggests the opportunity is worth pursuing despite the uncertainty. This is how I've made every major investment decision in my career. I never knew for certain what would happen, but I assessed probabilities, I considered magnitudes, I calculated expected values, and I made bets where the expected value was strongly positive. Sometimes those bets didn't work out. Sometimes the 30% chance of failure occurred. But over many decisions, the process of thinking probabilistically produces far better results than either avoiding all uncertainty or pretending you have certainty when you don't. The 12th principle is about understanding cycles and patterns. One of the most important things I learned from studying economic history is that the same patterns repeat over and over again. Economies go through cycles of expansion and contraction. Markets go through cycles of boom and bust. Societies go through cycles of rise and decline. These cycles are driven by fundamental cause and effect relationships that don't change, even though the specific details vary from one instance to the next. When you understand these cycles and patterns, you can position yourself to benefit from them rather than being blindsided by them. For example, I spent years studying debt cycles, how economies take on increasing amounts of debt during expansions until the debt burden becomes unsustainable, which triggers a contraction where debt is reduced through some combination of austerity, defaults, and money printing. This pattern has played out hundreds of times throughout history. Once you see the pattern, you can identify where in the cycle we currently are. You can anticipate what's likely to happen next, and you can position your portfolio accordingly. The same principle applies to your personal life and career. There are patterns in how organizations evolve, in how relationships develop, in how careers progress. If you study these patterns, if you learn from history and from other people's experiences, you can navigate your own life more effectively. You can see opportunities that others miss. You can avoid predictable mistakes. You can position yourself to benefit from inevitable changes rather than being harmed by them. Let me share the 13th principle, which is about the importance of meditation and reflection. In our modern world, we're constantly bombarded with information and stimulation. We're always connected, always busy, always moving from one thing to the next. Very few people create space for genuine reflection, for sitting with their thoughts, for processing their experiences, for thinking deeply about what they're learning and how they should evolve. I've practiced transcendental meditation for over 40 years, and it's been one of the most valuable habits I've ever developed. It gives me a way to step back from the constant stream of thoughts and stimuli, to observe my own mental patterns from a detached perspective, to access deeper levels of creativity and insight that are impossible to reach when your mind is constantly churning. The benefits compound over time. I genuinely believe that meditation has made me more creative, more emotionally balanced, better at seeing the big picture, and better at making difficult decisions under pressure. But you don't have to practice formal meditation to get similar benefits. The key is simply creating regular space for reflection. This could be daily journaling, long walks without your phone, dedicated thinking time where you're not consuming any information, or any other practice that allows you to step back and process rather than constantly consuming and reacting. In my experience, the people who create this space for reflection are dramatically more effective than people who are always in reaction mode. They learn more from their experiences. They identify patterns more quickly, they make better decisions, and they maintain their equilibrium even in difficult circumstances. The 14th principle is about understanding your own nature and working with it rather than against it. Every person has a unique set of abilities, preferences, and limitations. What comes easily to you might be incredibly difficult for someone else, and vice versa. What energizes you might drain someone else. What you find meaningful might seem pointless to someone else. There's no one right way to be or to live. The key is understanding your own nature, accepting it, and then building a life that's aligned with who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. This sounds obvious, but most people violate this principle constantly. They pursue careers that don't fit their natural abilities because those careers are prestigious or lucrative. They try to force themselves to be more social or more analytical or more detail-oriented or whatever, fighting against their nature rather than working with it. They judge themselves harshly for not being someone they're not. All of this creates enormous suffering and inefficiency. When you're constantly fighting against your own nature, you're swimming upstream. Life is hard enough when you're working with your nature. Working against it makes everything exponentially more difficult. At Bridgewater, we've invested heavily in understanding people's natural abilities and preferences through testing and observation. We use this information to match people to roles where their nature is an advantage rather than a limitation. Someone who's naturally detail-oriented and risk-averse might be terrible as an investor, but excellent in compliance. Someone who's naturally creative and comfortable with ambiguity might be terrible in operations, but excellent in research. There's no hierarchy of better or worse. There's only alignment or misalignment between a person's nature and the demands of their role. The same principle applies to your personal life. If you're naturally introverted, don't try to force yourself to be the life of the party. Build a social life that works for introverts. If you're naturally disorganized, don't beat yourself up about it. Build systems and find partners that compensate for that limitation. If you're naturally skeptical, embrace that and find contexts where skepticism is valuable rather than trying to become more trusting. Work with your nature, not against it. The 15th and final principle I want to share is about legacy and contribution. As I've gotten older and accomplished most of the conventional markers of success, I've thought a lot about what actually matters in the end. What I've concluded is that the only thing that really matters is how you've contributed to the evolution of the whole. Did you leave things better than you found them? Did you help other people grow and succeed? Did you create value that will outlast you? Did you share what you learned so others could benefit from your experience? This is why I've spent the last decade focused on sharing what I've learned rather than just accumulating more wealth. I've written books sharing my principles. I've created educational videos. I've worked to pass on what I know to the next generation at Bridgewater. I've given away more than half my wealth to philanthropic causes. None of this was about building my reputation or getting credit. It was about recognizing that I've been incredibly fortunate, that I've learned things that could help other people, and that sharing those things is the most meaningful way I can spend the time I have left. You don't need to be wealthy or famous to think this way. Everyone has knowledge and experience that could benefit someone else. Everyone has the opportunity to help other people grow. Everyone can leave their corner of the world a little better than they found it. When you shift your focus from what you can get to what you can give, from how you can succeed to how you can help others succeed, life becomes richer and more meaningful. This doesn't mean being selfless or sacrificing your own interests. It means recognizing that your interests and the interests of others are interconnected, and that contributing to something larger than yourself is actually the most fulfilling thing you can do. Looking back over my 75 years, over the 5 decades I spent building Bridgewater, over all the successes and failures and lessons learned, what I see most clearly is that life is a series of choices about how to approach reality. You can fight against reality or accept it. You can let your ego drive your decisions or subordinate your ego to truth. You can avoid pain or embrace it as a teacher. You can work against your nature or align with it. You can focus on getting or on giving. You can stay closed to new ideas or remain radically open-minded. You can repeat the same mistakes or extract principles and evolve. The great tragedy of modern life is that most people never make these choices consciously. They drift through life reacting to circumstances, driven by unconscious patterns and unexamined assumptions, never taking the time to step back and think clearly about how to live. They suffer predictable pain that could have been avoided. They pursue goals that won't make them happy. They make the same mistakes over and over, and they never realize that there was a better way. My hope is that by sharing these principles, by describing what I've learned through 5 decades of mistakes and successes, I can help you avoid some of that unnecessary suffering. I can help you see reality more clearly, make better decisions, evolve more quickly, and build a life that's truly meaningful to you. These principles have worked for me. They've helped me build one of the most successful investment firms in history. They've helped me navigate enormous challenges and painful failures. They've helped me maintain meaningful relationships despite the demands of my work, and they've given me a framework for making sense of life that I find deeply satisfying. Whether they'll work for you depends on whether you're willing to seriously engage with them, test them against your own experience, adapt them to your own circumstances, and commit to the difficult work of living according to principles rather than just reacting to life as it comes. That choice is yours to make.